It's a lot. We put a lot of time, energy, and resources into our training. I believe last year, the Minneapolis Police Department, in terms of our mandatory in-service training and leadership training, we probably spent about $8.5 million. In our pre-service and in-service training, that was probably about $4.5 million. So training is absolutely vitally essential to us as a department.
And officers are paid while they're being trained, is that correct?
Yes, they are.
And would it be fair to say that part of the objective of training is to impart Minneapolis Police departmental policies onto the officers so that they know what those policies are and are able to apply them?
Yes, it's important through training that we're reemphasizing not only our policies but really our values as a police department and what our community expects of us. It's to help our officers, and it's also to help our communities at the same time.
As a former patrol officer who's used force, put handcuffs on people, I mean, you understand the reality of what policing is like when you're actually on duty. Is that right?
That is correct.
You also testified that you've participated and continue to participate in the training that's been provided by MPD and has continued to be provided. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Is this training practical and useful?
Yes, it is.
Why do you say that?
Our officers are being called, particularly patrol officers, are being called to, again, respond in a way to our community's needs. And it's hundreds of thousands of calls that they respond to. And, we are a very interesting profession in that to some professions, your body of work matters. And to an extent, within the Minneapolis Police Department, our body of work matters, but it's more internally. But to our communities, for the most part, your body of work doesn't hold as much value. We don't have the luxury of being able to go up to a community member for the first time and say, those 99 calls I was on before went really well. Trust me on this one. We don't have the luxury of doing that. Our communities are going, no, what have you done for me lately? This interaction, I'm going to grade you on how you treat me during this call, during this interaction. And so we have to make each engagement with our community count. And so the training is very important because for many in our communities, the first time that they encounter a Minneapolis police officer may be the only time in their life they do. And so that singular incident matters.
Aside from the usefulness of it to the community, what about the usefulness of it from a practical standpoint to the patrol officer out on the street? Is this training practical, or is it more aspirational?
No, it's very practical, and as I had mentioned earlier, it's so important that we evolve as a police department and meet our communities where they are. And I'll give a couple examples if you don't mind. We've talked a lot about within the department that we know that our communities suffer at times and go through trauma. So it's very important for our men and women to have training as it relates to how we respond in those moments. What resources can we provide for community? But one of the things that we have not talked about in this profession, and sadly, is the impacts of trauma on our own officers. And so wellness, we do a great deal of training and work on officer wellness because we need to make sure that our officers are well when they're interacting with our communities in that regard. I will also tell you a few years ago, we were hearing from members of our transgender community and how they had felt police have played a role in their lives, and not always good, quite frankly. And so we were able to, through conversation, through discussion, through meetings, being very authentic, we were able to sit and craft a policy based upon members of our transgender, gender nonconforming community really guiding that. And we had the first policy ever in that. And so again, it's so important that we as a police agency continue to evolve, continue to place value on all of our community members, and so that's very important.
Now, speaking of Minneapolis police policies, you're aware that the police department has a fairly extensive policy and procedure manual. It's pretty thick, correct?
Yes.
And is it important then for policies and procedures to be in a written form so that officers can understand what the expectations are?
Yes, it is.
And those are public documents so that the public, they're also able to see what the expectations of the police officers are, correct?
That is correct.
As the chief of police and being employed by MPD as long as you have, I take it you're familiar with the Minneapolis Police Department policy and procedure manuals and all the content contained inside.
Yes.
You in fact created some of these policies.
That is correct.
Are Minneapolis police officers required to be familiar with the various written policies?
Yes, we are.
And there's a policy requiring them to be familiar with the policies, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
All right. So if you would please publish Exhibit 207. If you would highlight Section 1-103. This is the policy about the policy, and it requires that the MPD employees shall be provided instructions on how to access the policy and procedure manual. Is that right?
That is correct.
And they're accountable for knowing how and where to access, and for knowing the contents of the manual. Is that right?
That is correct.
And they're also required to sign a receipt acknowledging their responsibility for knowing the contents of the manual, correct?
Yes.
Because, the first policy manual that you would receive as a patrol officer might not be, 30 years later, what you're going to be looking at, correct?
Yes.
So the policies are changing, but they're published, they're public, and the officers are required to know what they are and to sign something saying that they will continue to review them. Is that right?
It's preliminary, overruled.
Yes.
All right. Well, if you could take that one down, please. At this time, asked to just display to the witness Exhibit 274 for identification. Sir, do you recognize this is a general form here of being an electronic version of the MPD policy and procedure manual acknowledgement?
Yes, I do.
This is an example of an acknowledgement form that a Minneapolis Police Department employee patrol officer would sign upon being hired. Is that right?
Yes.
Just indicating that they're aware that there are written policies and committing to reviewing them and accessing them. Is that right?